The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Carl Lisek. I will be your host for today's event. We're going to give it another 30 seconds. We have a large number of people that are registered for this webinar, so if we just give them another 30 seconds, we'll get going right away. Well, happy summer and welcome to today's webinar for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management's Indiana Statewide Electric Vehicle Charging Network. My name is Carl Lisek, Executive Director with South Shore Clean Cities. I will be acting as your host and presenter for today's webinar. As you know, there is a total of $6.15 million available with allocations of up to $5.535 million available for DC fast charging stations and up to $615,000 for level 2 charging station infrastructure. Applications are due September 23rd by 5 p.m. Eastern. And I know that sounds like it's a long time away, but it's really right around the corner. So this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the South Shore Clean Cities website as well as IDEM's website. South Shore Clean Cities is a third-party 501c3 nonprofit, and here is only to provide you with this information as a resource. As an applicant, you are not required to work with us or any other organization to submit a grant application under this solicitation from IDEM. Our goal is very simple. We are here to assist organizations on successful implementation of clean transportation programs here in Indiana. And as many of you know, South Shore Clean Cities' mission is to foster the economic, environmental, and energy security of Indiana and our nation by working to advance affordable domestic transportation fuels and energy efficient mobility systems and other transportation fuel saving technologies and practices. As part of the U.S. Department of Energy, our goal is to educate, advise, and deploy. As you know, all states have VW programs, and if you operate your fleet in other states, we'd be happy to assist you with introductions to other sister Clean Cities Coalition partners throughout the United States. This network consists of nearly 100 other Clean Cities coalitions. Submitting a successful grant application requires a lot of resources and planning. If you don't know where to start, contact South Shore Clean Cities for hands-on assistance, writing and preparing your grant applications. Our grant assistance includes to have key stakeholders engaged by establishing a partnering plan. We find this available also as membership to Clean Cities Grant Finder, as well as updates on all of the clean domestic technologies. We provide one-on-one personal grant consulting from senior electric vehicle and electric infrastructure grant consultants, unlimited application and narrative review by our team of experts, dedicated account management support and implementation partners, and we have a variety of stakeholders whom are national, international EV charging station providers to provide you with quotes and implementation opportunities. Just to note, South Shore Clean Cities has had a very high success rate across the state of Indiana, assisting organizations with transformational projects and programs. South Shore Clean Cities is very simple. We're here to implement networks of clean fuels and equipment across our huge state. Charging infrastructure has been identified as one of the largest unknowns and sources of anxiety for fleets considering near-term adoption of individual and medium and all sizes of battery electric vehicles. And while there's no one-size-that-fits-all solution to charging, there are key steps every fleet needs to consider to ensure they have a cost-effective charging strategy in place. Our recommendations for this application would be to have stakeholders engaged when establishing this charging plan, realistic timeframes for site planning, permitting, and charging installation, have appropriate charging station hardware options to support your vehicles and duty cycles, discuss smart load management, can make or break your economics of charging, and then knowing strategies and programs that your local utilities are going to deploy around vehicle electrification. Do you know what vehicles are currently available in Indiana and what new vehicles will be coming in the next several years? We do. We feel that South Shore Clean Cities can assist your team in answers to these questions. I would also offer this If you are a site host and believe you have a good potential location for a DC fast charger as well as a level 2 charger, please contact our office. And as you can see, based on the success that South Shore Clean Cities has had to date with the various IDEM BW mitigation grants. And so we've had a very large percentage of assisting organizations across the state with successful implementation of grant funds. So with that, I would now like to introduce you to Mr. Shawn Seals. Shawn is a Senior Environmental Manager with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, Office of Air Quality, and also serves as our state as the Indiana VW Administrator, and will be providing an overview of today's current grant opportunity. Shawn?
Well, thank you, Carl. And I believe that I have the capacity, I do, to move the slides. So I will continue to move the slides. Carl's already made the introductions, and for that I thank you all. Today we're going to talk a little bit, actually probably more than a little bit, about Indiana's statewide electric vehicle charging network request for proposals. This is a program that has been a couple years in the development. Many exciting things are happening through the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust program, and this is certainly one of the more exciting, if not potentially the most exciting one. So with that, let's touch a little bit on the things that we're going to talk about today. Some of these we'll talk about in depth. Some of these won't really require a whole lot of time or energy, but we're going to talk a little bit about the grant itself. We're going to talk about equipment types that are eligible for funding, who is eligible to be an applicant, what type of equipment will require what type of a cost share, the charging equipment, current locations. It's important to know, obviously, where those are now so that we can kind of fill in those gaps as we move forward. We're going to talk about a concept that is the Indiana roadway priorities. For those who have looked at the RFP, you've probably seen this and you may have some questions about it, so we'll talk a little bit about that too. Charging equipment detail requirements. Every program has to sort of set a list of expectations for the program so that we have, some sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of minimum specs that we're looking for. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those, but the RFP will provide a lot more detail. And we're going to talk about the eligible project costs and those that are not eligible. We're going to talk a little bit about the timeline and the funding agreements, what those might look like and what you might expect to see in one if you were lucky enough to receive an award from the program. We'll talk at the end, we'll start talking a little bit more about what the reporting requirements are going to be for a program such as this. And then sort of the application highlights, what you need to make sure to include in an application. And then we'll talk specifically about the scoring criteria and what the caps and the available points per criteria might be. So I recognize that sounds like a lot, and it is. So we're going to try to get through some of these slides that may or may not be all that pressing with a little bit more pace, just so we have a little more time for Q&A at the end. So as many know, in January 2017, the U.S. Justice Department finalized a consent decree with Volkswagen because of what they referred to as Dieselgate and basically the defeat devices that were installed within the software of these 2 and 3 liter diesel engines. Long story short, it resulted in about $2.9 billion that was paid into an environmental trust. And each state was basically allotted a percentage of this based on how many of those 2 or 3 liter vehicles existed at that time in each individual state as a ratio to the total. As a result, Indiana was allotted roughly $41 million to be used in a variety of ways under the consent decree. And like many states around us, Indiana also chose to set aside that maximum amount allowable under the consent decree to be used for electric vehicle charging equipment. In our case, the maximum percent is 15%, and that equates to roughly $6.15 million. And that $6.15 million is going to be made available through the RFP that hopefully you all have been able to take a look at. And we're intending for this to be a single round request for proposals. So we're putting it on the street and we're hoping to get high quality applications for both of the charging equipment types in one single round. So let's talk a little bit about the equipment types. I think a lot of this is probably pretty old hat for folks, but there are two types of EV charging equipment that will be eligible for funding under the program. The first, and probably the one that's most recognized, is direct current fast charge, also or often just referred to as DCFC, sometimes referred to as level 3, and level 2. And I think if you look at the sub-bullets of these two, it gives you a little bit of a feel for how the two might compare. You know, if you were to plug a vehicle in and try to get 80 miles of range out of it, with a DC fast charger, that 80 miles would take you about 30 minutes on the average to get to. And with a level 2 to get to that 80 miles, it would take you about 210 minutes to get to that same 80 miles of charge. Somewhat in accordance with what the request for information that we put out on the street in 2019 it informed us on how we should break down the total 6.15. And not only through the RFI process, but also through the conversation with the Volkswagen committee, Indiana has decided to set aside 90% of the available funds, which is roughly 5.535 million, for direct current fast charging across the state, and roughly 615,000 or 10% for level 2 charging equipment across the state. So eligible applicants, and I don't get a lot of questions about eligible applicants and who is eligible and why they're eligible necessarily, but there are some details that we want to kind of focus on. Whoops, my bad. That I think are important to note. So eligible applicants can be, but aren't only limited to these 4 items. It can be a for-profit business that's registered within the state of Indiana with the Secretary of State. It can be a nonprofit entity that's registered with the Indiana Secretary of State as well. They can be federal, state, or local government agencies, and they can also be Indiana-based metropolitan planning organizations. And although some of these organizations are welcomed and in most cases encouraged to coordinate with groups on an application, it's important to note that in the end, if an award is made, the agreement is going to be between IDEM and the site owner. It is not going to be with the MPO or the nonprofit organization. So just keep that in mind as you kind of move forward. I know there's often some conversation about, well, can we gather together this group of like entities and help them put together a application, maybe within a metropolitan planning organization. We want to put together a group of level 2 or DC fast charging sites for our area. Can we do that all in one application? And you know, that can be done in one application, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that really breaks down and some considerations that you'll need to make as we get a little farther into the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about eligible charging equipment cost share requirements. And also consistent with what was accepted by the Volkswagen committee, and pretty consistent with what we also saw within the request for information that was put on the street last year, asking for some input and insight on Indiana's program. We ultimately decided that for government agencies that are making these charging stations publicly available, the approximate cost is typically somewhere in the range of $200,000 is what we've been told is a reasonable cost to work from. So we're going to cover up to 90% or $180,000 for a direct current fast charge location with a government agency. And if it's an L2, those typically can go about 10 grand a piece. Once again, at 90%, we'll cover up to 90% or $9,000, whichever is the least, of course. Non-government agency, we're going to look at 80% across the board there. It's pretty much the same starting point, just looking for the non-government agencies to put a little bit more of their leveraging funds into the program. So it's important to know where our charging equipment is currently located, of course. And across Indiana, we have some DC fast charging equipment as well as some level 2 equipment. What you'll see on this map is the 18 non-Tesla DC fast charging locations in Indiana. And when we went through this process, we chose intentionally to take out the Tesla locations based on the fact that they are rather proprietary and they do not necessarily represent the full available network for those that are driving anything other than potentially a Tesla. When we look at that same map and use those same considerations for level 2, in the level 2 side, we are seeing, I believe it's more in the range of 171 non-Tesla chargers located across Indiana. And what you really see with these maps in large part is you do see more level 2 as well as direct current fast charging locations in your more urban areas. Not uncommon with what you see across the nation, just something that we will see it from time to time. So we talked a little bit about the Indiana roadway priorities, and every state tries to figure out the best approach when it comes to where to locate or where to put a priority or a preference for the installation of DCFC or even level 2 charging to a lesser degree, but mostly with the focus on DCFC because it's seen as the real silver bullet that's going to potentially broaden the use and the popularity of electric vehicles, helping folks get from their home to grandma's home or their grandchildren's home or whoever it might be. I know in my case, we live here on the south side of Indianapolis, and my parents are up in the Fort Wayne area, and having no capacity between here and there could be challenging for some of the vehicles that are out there. So one of the methods that we are looking at, or the method that we're looking at, and it's reasonably popular across the nation, is to focus not where the vehicles are necessarily, but where the vehicles could be. And by that, we're looking at roadways. We're looking at being able to develop a statewide connected network for Indiana. And when we think about Indiana and the crossroads of America, it's obvious that we have a lot of roadway options. So we reached out to our friends at INDOT, and they helped us put together what we think is a really fair and representative traffic map for the state. And this map is, you'll see the color coding that kind of gives some indication of the amount of annual average daily traffic for these selected corridors. So these corridors that you see, regardless of color, are really going to be the priority locations for our DC fast charging equipment. And it's important to note that this will also play a reasonably significant role in the scoring criteria that we'll talk about here down the road on the presentation. So the charging equipment detailed requirements. This is what we were talking about a little bit earlier when I mentioned sort of minimum specs. And I think it's important that every program have some sort of, minimum spec, if you will. Otherwise, you just don't know that you're necessarily going to get good quality applications. And if you're going to be, if the goal is to be good stewards of public funds, and these are more or less public funds, you want to make sure that the funds that are being put into the program are being put into it in the best possible way with the best possible chance for success. So This is why we created this list of detailed requirements. Now you'll notice in the introduction above the bullets that I have underlined, these are some of the highlights of the detailed requirements, but Appendix A of the RFP provides the longer, more complete list of those. So the first one is a really important one in that it's stating that, you know, we're looking for DC fast chargers that are located no more than 1 road mile off of the roadway priorities that we talked about in that previous slide map. You'll also see parenthetically that we are pretty reasonable as well. Exceptions may be considered on a case-by-case basis, provided there's the need for the exception is clearly documented and supported. We understand that there may be places where being 1.5 miles off the road is the best that can be done, and we just need, if you're going to, if an applicant is going to go beyond that 1 road mile, they need to make it really clear to us why that still makes sense. DC fast charging sites need to be rated at a minimum of 100 kilowatt hours. Now this can be done either with a single kilowatt hour unit or 2 50 kilowatt hour or kilowatt units, as long as 100 kilowatts can be provided to 1 charging vehicle, or 50 can be provided to 2 vehicles charging at the same time. In short, what this basically means is if there's a vehicle that's capable of charging up to 100 kilowatts, we want the site to be able to provide that to them if they are the only vehicle there. However, if there are 2 vehicles there wanting to charge at the same time, we want to make sure that both vehicles will at least be able to charge at 50. So that's the intention of that. DCFC will provide both CHAdeMO and CCS connectors at each site, so that there is some flexibility. It gives you a little more opening for different types of vehicles, obviously. And then on the L2 side, every site will have at least 2 J1772 connectors. So it's not just a a 1 connector site. We're expecting and requiring that there's 2 connectors at each site, whether it's DC fast or level 2. Now the equipment needs to be networked either by Wi-Fi or cellular connection, and that network hardware and software needs to be maintained. And that does apply to both DC fast and level 2. We want the program in Indiana to be a networked program. That's becoming pretty consistent across the nation. The intent of that, of course, is so that we can see what equipment is being used, how much it's being used, and kind of predict how useful it might be in the future, and learn from it too, so that we can make good decisions as we move down the road. Now you'll see that we made the comment about maintaining. The next bullet goes into a little bit more depth on that. The equipment that is installed must have at least a 5-year warranty with the option of an additional ongoing maintenance and support that has an uptime guarantee on that equipment of 95% or greater for the full lifetime of the charging station. There is no sense in putting a charging station out there if it's not available to be used to people. So having a warranty there in place to make sure that it's taken care of is very important. Having a 95% uptime guarantee is also very important. And then should a repair to the facility be necessary, the chargers will be functionally or fully operating within 72 hours of the equipment or the issue breakdown to once again ensure that 95% annual uptime guarantee. Excuse me. So we'll talk a little bit about the eligible and ineligible costs now. And the actually, it looks like we're starting. Let me go back here real quick. Multiple screens don't always work to our advantage, but they do in some ways. So we'll catch up. Let's talk about what is eligible first, because that's a little more exciting. So eligible project costs under the program include the DC fast charging station, the power conversion, the hardware, the associated equipment with required warranties. And that when we say required warranties, we're talking about that 5-year. Level 2 charging station, hardware, associated equipment, once again with those same warranties. The supporting costs such as a final design, engineering, and permitting are relevant to the total project cost. Utility upgrades such as transformers and extensions, if those are necessary in the location, those are eligible costs. The initial networking subscription activation fees for a charging network. As we said, that the program is expecting that these are going to be network pieces of equipment that may require a subscription. And I've reached out to some of the vendors, excuse me, some of the vendors to follow up and make sure that what they originally were sharing with me was still the case. And you'll see that it says that these are often included as a component of the required 5-year warranty as detailed in Appendix 5. Now, what that is not saying is that they are a part of the warranty. What that is saying is that it is a line item. The networking and subscription fees can be a line item added to the contract or the agreement that would also include the 5-year warranty, sort of as an add-on or whatever it might be. Any payment module as required by the program is of course eligible under the program. Cord and cable management strategy. Nobody wants to trip over these cords, that's for sure. Battery storage where appropriate, of course. And then also construction and or installation costs directly related to the charging station, such as dedicated parking spaces, electrical services and connection, on-site sign installation of lighting and shelter and awning and construction. Basically those things related to the construction process for the site that makes the site operable, lit, and safe. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the ineligible project costs. Research projects and studies are not going to be eligible under the program, nor are feasibility studies to do surveys and determine the interest in the installation of an EV charging station. That's not what the program is designed to cover. Proposals for any type of vehicle demonstration or demonstration of existing technologies. I mean, most of this technology is pretty commonplace right now. There's no need for funding of demonstration projects in reasonably proven technologies. Land and parking space purchase and lease is also not eligible for funding under the program. A level 1 infrastructure, obviously, the home charging units is what we're talking about here. Those are also not eligible under the program. And then the internet and cellular connection, the Wi-Fi or the cell program that allows for the ongoing connection that allows for the networking to pull the data necessary for reporting. The connection itself is not eligible, only the networking side. Going on with some of the ineligible project costs, and many of these are obvious to folks, but these are the ones that we just kind of pulled out that are probably that might result in some questions down the road. Ongoing or annual networking subscription fees for a charging network outside of those included in the 5-year warranty as listed in Appendix A. This goes back to what I was saying a couple slides ago about the 5-year agreement. That agreement may include the 5-year warranty, but it could include a couple other things. And the long and the short of it is the program is willing to fund the appropriate things within that 5-year time frame, but starting in year 6, the program will no longer be funding those components. Electricity consumption and demand charges, obviously, I would think. General maintenance or repair of the equipment or facilities, administrative costs, signs and installation of signs located off-site or along adjacent roadways directing driveways to the locations. Other capital costs such as construction of buildings, parking facilities, etc. Construction or installation of site amenities such as things like restrooms. Those would not be eligible under the program. So the estimated timeline for the program, we obviously posted this. It went live on June 23rd. The goal was to put it out there for at least 3 months. So September 23rd, it will be out there for roughly 13 weeks, and that is the receipt deadline for any applications. Within the following weeks, say within the next 4 weeks, we'll take the time to have the team review, score, and kind of identify recommendations to take to the committee We're hoping to do that by October 21 of this year. We will select the proposals and make the notifications, ideally around the end of October. This is a process that, as those who have been connected to the program overall understand, things go to the Volkswagen committee ultimately for a review and approval. IDEM will do the technical side of the work. IDEM will make recommendations based on that technical side. And then the Volkswagen committee will choose to either approve those recommendations, alter those recommendations, or whatever it might be. So that's ultimately when that notification is going to happen. It'll be driven in large part by when everybody is able to get together for that meeting and have that conversation. Probably within the next month after that, the grant agreements or contracts would be fully executed. The process is a little bit more efficient now than it used to be as far as contracting within the state, since we've gone to an all electronic approach. Hopefully that what has been working on the Volkswagen diesel side will be able to work consistently on this side as well from a timing standpoint. And then all the projects must be completed no later than December 31, 2022. So we've got a lot of time to finish these projects. What we're hearing, generally speaking, is 18 months is a very reasonable amount of time from beginning to end for a project to go from start to finish. We are obviously providing in excess of that, so we're hopeful that everything should come along and finish by the end of 2022. So let's touch a little bit on the funding agreement itself, because I think these things will be important for those that are selected for awards, some things that they'll need to know. All projects, they need to be completed as noted before, no later than December 31, 2022. Now, if an application indicates that a project can't be completed within this time frame, it's not going to be considered for funding. I guess the long and the short of that is, if you have a location and a site that you're excited about and you want to apply for it, but you don't think that that site can actually be up and online until 2023, it is not something that we would even look at and consider for funding. The close date, the end date, the in-service date, call it what you will, can be no later than December 31, 2022. It's important to note that no costs to be reimbursed may be incurred before the execution of the funding agreement or the contract. By state statute, the state does everything in arrears, and until we have a legally binding contract in place, we do not actually have the statutory authority to reimburse you for the work that you have done. So you do not want to do any work that incurs costs that you would be seeking reimbursement for prior to the execution of the funding agreement itself. Now, if a successful applicant fails to deliver an executed agreement within 30 days of receipt, IDEM at our discretion may cancel the award and award the funds to another applicant. I think what's important to note here is, if you apply for funding from this program, you want to make sure that you are fully on board, and it's not at the time later down the road when you receive the funding agreement that's when you start to seriously think about the financials and the contractuals and the legals related to the project, because you're only going to have 30 days to turn that grant agreement or funding agreement or contract back around. So the charging locations must be in operation for no less than 5 years. You'll see a lot of things are geared towards 5 years. And I think that's an important time frame. That's enough time to demonstrate whether a location is a sustainable location, whether it's an opportunity for a location to actually be self-sustaining and have a business model to maybe expand. These things are, I think 5 years is a good timeline for these things to happen within. Upgrades are permitted to these sites, but the number of charging plugs and the minimum charging capability shall not be reduced. So if during that period of time, folks want to do anything with those sites, that's fine, but you can't make it less than the site it was to start. Reimbursement requests and all required documentation is due to IDEM within 1 month after the completion of the project. Now, no reimbursement will be made for any costs incurred in the development of a project that's not successfully completed and placed in service. And the second sentence is intended to give you an indication of what we mean when we say completion of the project. Completion of the project in the case of these programs is the project is complete, the units are there, and if I bring my electric vehicle to it and plug in, it will receive a charge. That is a completed project. Until you reach that point, they are not eligible for reimbursement. Grantees should expect to allow a minimum of 90 days for reimbursement processing. Going through the Volkswagen Trust, it's great to have such a large amount of financial support for projects like these. But as one can imagine, when it is a national consent decree and it is a trust managed by a relatively well-known banking industry, or someone well-known in the banking industry, there's going to be a lot of detail that goes into this process. So expect about 90 days from the time that you submit your reimbursement request to the time that those funds would potentially be wired back to your account. And then all information submitted to IDEM over the course of the project, including records supporting expenditure of funds, is subject to inspection by interested parties. Obviously, we're a state agency. We have to play within those rules. And disclosure to the public, subject, of course, to any applicable confidentiality exceptions provided in applicable state or federal laws. And they need to exist in state or federal laws. Just keep that part in mind. So we've talked quite a bit about the networking, and we've talked quite a bit about, locations that are sustainable. And the reporting requirements is the data that's going to help drive that. This is the data that will be pulled through those networking agreements. And this is also the data that can then be used to determine, whether that was a good location for a site or not. I think we have to be honest and recognize that there will be some sites that ultimately will be funded that will be more successful than we expected, and there will be some that might be less successful than we expected. And this is the data that will let us know that. So, for 5 years, we're going to be receiving data that tells us things like the number of charging events. And that's, literally how many times did somebody plug in? The connect and disconnect times, how much of a day, so to speak, are these units being used? Start and end charge times, how long when a vehicle is there, was it really there? The number of unique vehicles connected. The systems, of course, are smarter than most of us, and it knows if it's the same vehicle that's been plugged in twice. So how many unique vehicles actually use that facility? What was the total kilowatt hours that were dispensed for a charging event? What's the average kilowatt hour per charging event? Peak kilowatt per event, and the peak power kilowatt by time and date. What time of day are people actually using these things the most? And what is the peak power that's actually available to the location at that point? Peak power demand by the month. Average duration of the charging events, and then the percentage of station downtime. We talk a little bit about that 90%, 95% uptime guarantee. This obviously is one way that we will be able to find out what the what the downtime of a site might be. So let's talk a little bit about the application process and what that might look like. I think the first and most important thing, and probably not a surprise to anyone, is that Indiana is only accepting electronic grant applications in response to the RFP. And those grant applications will be emailed not to me, but to the email address vwtrust@idem.in.gov. If you send them to me, I might just reply back and let you know you need to send it to that address. However, there's also times where I'll just go ahead and bounce it forward on your behalf. But note that that is the official email address for any applications any applications for funding from the Volkswagen program as a whole. The applications need to be in either Microsoft Word or PDF format. They're going to be due, as we've already said, September 23rd of 2020. An application cannot exceed 15 pages in length, and it should include the following. 15 pages feels like an adequate amount of space to tell the story of why your application is a strong application, without it being a 45-page application that may or may not be able to, hold the detailed attention of a reviewer. So what you want to make sure to include in the application is obviously any key contact information. You want that budget for your project to be very clear, and you want to make it very clear what you're requesting. It may seem odd, but there are times where we have received applications for a project and the applicant did not tell us how much of the total cost of that piece of equipment they wanted to get funding to cover versus how much they were willing to fund themselves. So you'll make sure that that's very clear to us. The project schedule and milestones, what is your estimate of what the project's going to look like when you roll it out? And then a narrative description of the project that includes at least some of the following things, and the RFP has a lot more detailed requirements in it. But give us a summary of the project and how it's going to benefit air quality in that area. Why is it important that that location has this EV charging station? Let us know what your plan for measuring progress and how success will be evaluated. And when we say measuring progress, we're not asking you to run some sort of statistical analysis to tell us what the air quality benefit will be. If you want to do that, that's great, but that's not what we're asking. We're just asking for you to generally tell us, how would you measure this to be a successful project? What are you looking for to justify it as a successful project? A clear description of the physical location or locations of the charging station sites. There are parts of Indiana that the team knows really well, and there are parts of Indiana where the team does not know so very well. So make sure that you've got some really clear indication. Maps, of course, would be helpful to let us know where you're envisioning putting that charging station and why it makes sense to put it there. And then a demonstration that the current or anticipated utilization supports long-term viability of the site. And in essence, what we're really looking for here is, show us that there's enough traffic now, and maybe our map shows you that, and that's all you need to refer to. But beyond the map, if there are other things that you can use to demonstrate that there is a current demand for this, there's current utilization for expanding the use of this, and give us some insight as to why you think that this is a meaningful, long-term, and viable location. So we're going to talk a little bit about the quantitative scoring criteria, I believe, in the next slide, but let's talk a little bit about the qualitative scoring criteria, because consistent with what we have done with the other Volkswagen programs that are focused more on diesel emission reductions, it's important for us to consider not only just the quantitative side, but also the qualitative side of any application. So these are some of the considerations that will go into the evaluation process as well. And the first one being a reasonable geographic distribution of the projects across the state. We say we want this to be a statewide charging network. Well, statewide means exactly that. So we want to make sure that we're doing our best to have some geographic distribution of the projects. A collaboration among a diverse set of stakeholders to advance a broader environmental vision or goal for the area. If you're working with some other stakeholders to kind of help encourage greater use of electric vehicles in the area, greater implementation of charging locations over and above those that are funded through the program, let us know what that is so we know. Evidence of regional support of a project. We kind of talked a little bit about one of the more obvious ways to do that earlier in the presentation, and that was, if for example, there is a coalition in an area or a metropolitan planning organization in an area that either applies for or helps to coordinate applications, that's evidence of regional support of a project and the program overall. Evidence of a clear plan of action, milestones, and a schedule for project completion. We talked a little bit about that in the narrative, having sort of some timelines, milestones, and a schedule. But I think the other addition here is, if you show us that you have a clear plan of action, that this is just part of a greater project that you have envisioned in this area, make sure we know that. These are important qualitative things for us to consider. An evidence of a commitment by the owner to maintain the equipment, and evidence of the project implementation feasibility without significant obstacles to ensure continued use of the charging station. And I think what this really is getting at is, I talked a little bit earlier about the fact that we know there will be some locations that are going to be more successful than we envisioned and some that might be less successful than we envisioned. And, make sure that we don't feel like this is going to be a less successful location from the outset. Demonstrate to us that, there are no obstacles to you getting this project done. You can do that through a lot of the bullets that are above as well. So let's talk a little bit about the quantitative evaluation criteria or scoring criteria. Now, these, I will say, what you're seeing here, the points, the points that we have listed here, this is the maximum available points. We, unlike some of the other programs, we don't have a specific template, for lack of a better term, yet in place that sort of identifies what would receive 10 points versus 15 versus 25. So what you see on this slide are the maximum points available for each of these specific criteria. So as you can see, and we talked about a little earlier, the highest point category, of course, is the cost effectiveness of the project. And this is ultimately going to be a ratio of the total investment of Volkswagen program funds to the average annual daily traffic of that project location. So we're going to look at the amount of money that you're asking for, and we're going to compare that to that map, and we're going to do a little bit of math, and that's going to be how we arrive at where you fit in that 25-point category. So obviously those projects that are, in the really high traveled areas where there is, demonstrated traffic, but also a demonstrated need, they have a good chance of scoring high in that area. Long-term sustainability and maintenance of the site. So what we're really saying here is the ability to continue efforts or expand the project even after the mitigation project funding is utilized. You can get up to 20 points here if you can clearly demonstrate to us that there is a long-term plan for how this location will stay viable beyond just the 4 years of funding assistance. 20 points available there. You can also get 20 points for projects that complement other programs for a statewide network, or the application itself supports a statewide network. And what we're getting at here is the ability of the proposal to meet the goal for a statewide network and to fill in infrastructure gaps. We talked a little bit and showed those two maps earlier in the presentation that sort of give some indication of where there might be some gaps as far as DC fast and level 2 chargers. So if you can demonstrate that your location and your project really complements the statewide network as a whole and helps to fill in this gap, there's 20 points available in that regard. Verified leveraging of additional resources, and you'll see this is financial only. This is really a cash program, so to speak. And a question was raised early on, I think maybe in one of the public hearings, well, what if somebody donates the land to put a site on? Can we count the market value of that donated land as a part of the match? And good, bad, or otherwise, the answer there is no. What we have to do is we have to just look at the dollars and cents of the equipment and the process to install that equipment. It's just more straightforward. It doesn't get us into gray areas. And since we're awarding up to 15 points here for verified leveraging, we want to make sure that it is actual cash value that we're looking at. Or I shouldn't even say cash value, I should just say cash, so to speak. So that's going to be an important component as well. So project readiness is obviously really, really important, and it boils down to, is this project shovel ready? You know, and what is the projected build time? I know for a fact that there are applicants out there who they haven't filled out their applications yet, they haven't submitted them yet, but they know where they want to put it, they know how much it's going to cost, and they're ready to go as soon as the Attorney General's office signs their agreement if they were awarded funds. You know, those are important projects. We want them to be shovel ready. We don't want to be in a holding pattern and lose out on an opportunity to use these funds to you know, broaden the state's EV network. And then the last piece for 10 points is the quality of site marketing and amenities. You know, amenities such as restrooms, food, shopping, marketing, just general marketing of the site location to consumers. I know that earlier in a slide it says that, you know, the program does not pay for things such as restrooms. However, if the site is located in a place that has restrooms and has shopping and has some of these other things that would draw people in, you know, there's 10 points available for that, and you want to make sure that you let us know that. I think an important, just sort of a catch-all for scoring in our programs has always been, you know, and I've said this for years, you know, this is your opportunity to tell me the story. You tell me the story of why your project deserves funding, why your project is the best project there is, bar none. If you do that well, you're going to score high. You're going to score high in virtually all of these categories, and you're going to increase your likelihood of having a project that ultimately would get funded under the program. So that kind of closes up the majority of the, I think, meaningful details of the RFP. I did mention before that the applications need to go to the email address of vwtrust@idem.in.gov. There is a VW Trust website specifically that you can go to get more information. I would presume that most, if not all of you, have been there, done that. And then I think the last thing, just pointing out that, you know, I'm here to help in any way that I can within the limitations of, you know, being a grant administrator. And my contact information is there. If you have a question, feel free to shoot those questions directly to me at sseals@idem.in.gov. However, the applications, remember, do not go to me. They go to the VW Trust email address. So with that, I think that I will pass it back to our friends at South Shore and let them sort of take it from here.
Well, thank you, Shawn. As you get caught up on taking a sip of water there, we do have the opportunity for folks to ask questions in the chat box. So if you'd like to go ahead and begin sharing any of the questions that you have, these questions will be documented and put on the IDEM and South Shore Clean Cities websites for future answers and things like that. But Shawn will attempt to answer these questions as they become available. And unfortunately, due to the amount of attendees that we have, we want to do this via chat. So we do have one question that has come in, and it's I will just say this, Shawn. It's our school corporation is planning on applying for the 2021 VW funds for an electric transit bus. May we request a station even though the station would be built before the bus has arrived? So that's the question.
I don't see a reason why you could not make that application. I think you know, it would certainly be eligible. I think the thing that you would want to think about before putting a lot of time and energy into that application is whether that site would necessarily score well under the categories of sustainability and viability, because, you know, in large part, the program and the intent is really designed to improve the network across Indiana to get from A to B to C. So it's definitely something that you can do. Just think about whether you feel that it's worthy use of your time when you take a closer look at the RFP and the evaluation criteria.
Okay, so the question that came in would be, I wasn't aware that charging infrastructure for a bus was considered light duty. and I know this is a light duty application. However, this would be, I'm assuming that the school bus would be a publicly available, not only to the, a transit bus would be not only be available for the transit bus, but for other potential vehicles in that specific community.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point. I mean, I think one of the things that that I may have overlooked in the question was, the vehicle itself, because it is light duty focused. And that's why you see, the highways and byways, the roadways being the primary focus. So the program isn't really intended nor designed to be there to cover the cost of infrastructure for medium and heavy duty. It is really focused on light duty.
The next question is, are there any restrictions on charging station revenue?
There are no restrictions on charging station revenue at this time. Contained within the RFP, we have not addressed that. We have not chose to necessarily police that. But one of the things I think that is important to note, and this is really related to any of the questions and any of the answers that we really talk about here today, is we not only is the RFP live, we also have 90 days to kind of learn from the RFP. But what I would say in the case of that question is that it's not really the goal nor the intent of the program to police the rates that folks are charging. We would only hope that, based on the fact that the program has supported the installation and the first 5 years in large part, that the rates within that 5-year period in particular would be considerably, would be reasonable.
Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in. Is the combination of DC and level 2 charging required on all projects, or can a project have just one of these types of stations? So they're asking, is there a combination of DC and level 2 required on all projects, or can a project have just one of these types of stations?
A project can absolutely have just one type of these stations. And I think that there is a point in the RFP that sort of touches on that. And I will openly admit that it is a little confusing. And we literally played with the language on that one for, it seemed like, an hour for this one sentence alone, trying to come up with something that we thought conveyed what the intention there was. If you are someone who's applying for just DC fast charge, that's fine. Just apply for DC fast charge. If there are more than one location, if you're looking at more than one site within a single application, we are going to ask you to prioritize these sequentially so that you can give us your understanding of where the most important location might be of the ones that you're applying for. In the case that maybe you want to put 10, you turn in an application for 10 sites, we need you to tell us from a scale of 1 to 10 which one of these sites you believe is the most likely to succeed. So if perchance we are in a position where we can only fund half of the amount requested, we will be able to look at your application and say, okay, well, that would cover these 5, so at least we know where we're going with those 5. The confusion kind of lies in, there's a statement within the RFP that indicates if someone applies for a DC fast application, regardless of the number of sites, and they want to add in that application a level 2 charging location or site also, that they can do that as leveraged funds. So that would be kind of a part of their match, would be the addition of a level 2 location at this DC fast location. Does that make sense?
Yep, sure
Okay.
does. So another question that we have, and this might be something that you can't answer, but I might be able to answer, is do you have a list of potential DC fast charging vendors or models in regards to equipment? So does the state have a listing of DC fast charging vendors that they would potentially recommend? I guess that's the way I would take it.
Yeah, and it's a reasonable question, and the answer is no, we do not. The state, in the case of this statewide charging network program, it is not our intent to create a short list, if you will. So yes, Carl, if you have a list that you're willing to share with folks, that's absolutely fine. But we have no preferred vendors because we openly recognize that the folks that have to deal with these vendors is not going to be the state. It's going to be the applicants and the site owners. So they should be the ones choosing who the vendors are based on their own due diligence and not ours.
Okay, and just to answer that question, South Shore Clean Cities would have a listing of all of our DC fast charging vendors and level 2 vendors that would be available that we would be happy to share with potential other members. So, so thank you for that question. And can a public applicant use joint procurement services such as Sourcewell? So meaning Sourcewell is, Shawn, if you're not familiar with Sourcewell, they basically, they've done all the pre-bidding for a governmental entity, gone out for bid, so that meets the purchasing requirements for a lot of our governmental entities. And so I guess the question would be, so the grant applicant, I would have, so if they would use a joint procurement service such as Sourcewell for this grant application to get the best price or the best bang for their buck.
Yeah, the state would have no issues with that at all. As a matter of fact, if those exist and they make for a more cost-effective investment for folks, we would certainly encourage that.
Wonderful. So, and I think one of the last questions that we do see here is that in the RFP, it mentions concerning deployment of charging stations along specific interstates. What about some of the more rural areas of Indiana that would need DC fast chargers from a tourism perspective? Should we not even apply for this grant?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we openly recognize that the corridor scenario may feel like it's leaving some really valid locations out. There are locations off the beaten path that do get a ton of traffic that you just aren't going to see on that map. So this kind of comes back to that tell me the story comment that I made earlier, in that it's certainly an eligible application, and we would certainly encourage you to apply. We would only ask that, if you'll recall, there is an exclusion, or not an exclusion, but there are exceptions to that 1 mile rule. You just need to let us know why it makes sense to put a charging station there, maybe 2, 3, 5, 10 miles off of that roadway. If you make a good argument for that, it's certainly something we're going to look closely at, because we know that, especially in a state like Indiana, we do have a lot of roadways, but we do have a lot of interesting things that are a little off the beaten path that certainly could justify a close look for, a DC fast charger or a level 2 charger as well.
Wonderful. And I think if anybody else has any questions, please share that right now. Shawn, any closing thoughts before we close the webinar?
Nothing real pressing. I think a key thing that I would encourage anybody who's considering an application to do is don't read the RFP just one time. I'm guilty of that myself whenever I look at some of the federal opportunities out there. Read it a couple times, because there are some details in there that are really, really important. And you don't want to discover those things after you've spent a lot of time and energy working on an application, gathering up quotes, only to find out that it isn't actually a piece that would be eligible for funding, for example. So, do your due diligence, of course, and a part of that is making sure that you take a really close look at the RFP. And I think probably the last thing, and in my mind, the most important thing, one of the goals that I kind of set for myself is to be as accessible as I can be, even in this COVID-19 era, which I know is challenging. Email works really, really, really well for me. I get it all the time. I seem to never log out. I get complaints from home about that too often. But I think it's important to be accessible to answer questions when I can. And what I'm basically asking folks to do is, if you have questions, if you are confused about something, don't hesitate to just drop me an email. If it's something that you think the folks at South Shore are better, better equipped to answer, by all means ask them. And it could be that you reach out to them and they say talk to Shawn. It could be that you reach out to me and I say talk to them. These things will happen. But don't be afraid to ask the questions, because we're all kind of learning as we go through this process. And for me personally, it's important to hear those questions, because when I hear those questions, then I understand where there might be some confusion that we want to clarify. And whether we clarify that in some minor tweaks to the RFP, or whether we clarify that by creating a frequently asked questions document to post to the website, I think it's important that we do that to the best of our ability. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Okay, and I think we have one last question here, Shawn, time permitting, is so with the grant applications, a DC fast charging application, would you be requiring a specific site host and address for that potential application? So I know you talked about doing due diligence. So, some of the DC fast chargers along the interstates potentially would require, obviously, a very specific address of a potential stakeholder. And, if it, so how much detail in regards to the grant application, if there was a specific exit off an interstate, would that be enough due diligence, or do you need a specific address and name of that potential site host?
I would say, to the greatest extent possible, what we need is as much detail as you can possibly give us. And I think why that is important is, if you just say, we think we want to install a DC fast charger on exit 36 off of Interstate 65 because we see a lot of traffic there, that's cool. But if you say all of that, and then you say specifically, we want to put it at this station located at this address, that's showing us a little more clearly that you're shovel ready. And I think that's an important part of the, important part of the answer is, the more detailed you can be with telling us where this thing is going to be, the more comfortable we are with presuming this is a shovel-ready project. We're just going to put it generally here because we think it makes sense. Is just not going to score as well as we're going to put it on the corner of, Main and Elm, in the back lot of Ace Hardware or something. That, that's pretty precise. We have to presume you have an understanding with that organization and you're ready to go.
Okay, well, Shawn, I think we've concluded all the questions. So I wanted to thank you very much for your time today on this presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in this webinar. Again, this will be posted on the IDEM website and will also be posted on South Shore Clean Cities. And we'll have a listing of all the questions also that will be available. So again, thank you for this presentation, Shawn, and everyone, thank you for your time. And I'm sure Shawn is going to look forward to some great grant applications. So have a great day, everybody, and thank you again.